It was in a town like this that the young man learned magic from an old man. There was no grand purpose or noble reason behind it. The old man simply needed followers, and the boy, in turn, needed knowledge, no matter how harsh the master was. One day, the young man observed the old man from afar. He didn't care about the man's nature, as he had his own goals, and so an exchange of interests began. The boy began to follow the old man, absorbing every lesson. Winter arrived, and spring followed it. A whole year passed. Throughout that time, the young man trained tirelessly. He strove to master the flow of mana, overcoming exhaustion. His progress, however, began to surprise the old master, until, finally, the boy felt something different. A new power awakened. With a year's worth of effort, he unleashed his magic for the first time. And so it was that, after a year of work, the young apprentice became a one-star mage. He hit the target dead center.
The boy expected some kind of recognition, but the master remained silent. The old master showed no surprise. In fact, his expression was one of pure disdain, but the young man was not shaken by it. His determination was unwavering. Time passed, and night arrived. Drunk, the old master began his usual speech about how nobles were superior. He insisted that lineage was everything in magic, and that a commoner's effort was useless. The boy just listened in silence, already used to the same words. Later the night deepened around the campfire. The young man watched the sleeping master. Until one day, everything changed. The young apprentice found his master lying on the ground, in the cold rain. The old man was dead. There was nothing left to be done. Alone, in the storm, the young man carried the body of the only master he ever had. Under the relentless rain, the young apprentice gave his master a simple burial. It was the end of a painful chapter.
At that moment, the weight of loneliness hit him hard. He was truly alone in the world. But it was in his moment of greatest desolation that something broke reality. A choice was presented to him. Having nothing left to lose, the boy made a decision, one that would change his destiny forever. And so, 4 years passed. In that time, his path crossed with that of Katya Flameheart, an exiled mage from a fallen noble house. Seeking a new purpose, the young man enlisted in the Beldun Mercenary Corps, where Katya also worked. She saw potential in the boy and took him under her wing. Under Katya's tutelage, he learned much more than his old master could have ever taught. Their base of operations was a local tavern. During a conversation, Katya confirmed what the young man, now called Derek, already suspected. He possessed a natural talent. She then decided it was time to begin more serious training. Derek listened attentively, ready to absorb every word.
The first lesson was simple. She instructed him to connect with his inner power. The apprentice obeyed, diving into his own energy to feel the flow of his mana. Following Katya's instructions, Derek released his magic. The master observed the result, surprised by the intensity of the boy's power. The strength of the magic was so great that it surprised them both. The power released was so strong that it caused a bang outside. The sudden noise startled the other customers, who thought they were under attack. Derek realized the chaos he had caused. Without wasting time, Katya grabbed him by the hand. She pulled him outside, instructing him to follow her in silence. The noise attracted the attention of the guards, who began to investigate the alleged explosion. Katya hurriedly led him through an alley. They needed to get out of there before they were discovered. Upon finding a safe place, she stopped to explain the gravity of the situation. The young apprentice did not understand why there was so much fuss. Katya then began to explain about the dangerous world of nobles and their privileges. She revealed that magic, especially at such a high level, was considered the greatest of all privileges, something a commoner like him should not have. In the past, Katya told Derek about a proposal she received to be a private tutor for the prestigious House Elveston. The young man listened carefully, feeling the weight of that revelation. The family was so influential that even the Grand Duke of the capital treated them with due respect. For Katya, that was an offer she simply couldn't refuse, and so she prepared to leave. After all, becoming a magic teacher to a noble of that caliber was a blessing for anyone. Before leaving, she said goodbye and left a spellbook as a gift for Derek. A year passed, and during that time, the young man studied by. And so, the last book was closed. After a whole year of dedication, his preparation was finally complete. The study time was over. With all the necessary knowledge acquired, now it was time to put the plan into practice. The long preparation had come to an end. Now, only the execution remained, and in his gaze there was no room for failure. The starting point for the mission was a local tavern, the Beldun Tear. Inside, the young man went straight to the counter to find his contact. From the reception, the man was already waiting for him. The boy confirmed the identity of the man in front of him. It was Derek, the contact he was looking for. Without beating around the bush, the young man went straight to the point. They needed to talk. The reception, however, was cold. The older man stared at him with clear disapproval, while the woman next to him seemed visibly uncomfortable with the situation. However, amidst that cold reception, one lady seemed genuinely happy with his arrival. The arrival of the young white-haired man did not go unnoticed by the house servants. He stared back at them with a coldness that made his purpose clear. Then, a woman stepped forward to greet him. The man accompanying the boy watched the scene with suspicion, while the young man began the conversation. With a gesture, the woman's identity was revealed. The young man waited, watching everyone's reaction. She introduced herself as Diela, the younger sister. She was the reason he was there. The revelation seemed to catch him by surprise for a moment. The conversation then turned to the family's bad reputation, mentioning the difficulty in keeping employees and the difficult temperament of one of the members. Suddenly, the office door burst open. A young man stormed into the room, furiously questioning his father's decision.
The boy marched towards the desk, not caring about the other person in the room. The father, however, remained impassive in the face of his son's fury, continuing his work. The young man's anger turned against a helpless maid as he vented about Diela's uselessness. The young maid just cried, terrified by the outburst of fury. A blond man watched the scene, his expression serious in the face of the family conflict. The young man, Rayo, continued to list his sister Diela's flaws, trying to convince his father. He leaned over the table, insisting on his point of view. But his father seemed unmoved. Suddenly, the discussion was interrupted by the arrival of the man in the white uniform. Iselin listened to the conversation with an expression of displeasure. Rayo, in turn, seemed inflexible in his opinion. The image of his sister, Diela, came to his mind, along with another dark-haired young woman. The memory seemed only to strengthen his conviction.
The father, however, finally showed his impatience, with a cold smile on his face. Rayo tried to argue once more, not noticing the change in his father's expression. In a sudden and violent movement, the older man grabbed his own son's hair, and then he slammed Rayo's head against the table with brutal force. The father's gaze was merciless, a clear demonstration of power. He kept his son pressed against the wood, silencing him by force. Fallen on the floor, wounded and humiliated, Rayo tasted his own blood. The lord of the house remained silent, his gaze cold and calculating. At that moment, Aiseline and the young apprentice arrived at the scene. They introduced themselves formally before the man. Aiseline seemed confident, as if she already expected that encounter. Suddenly, the great doors of the hall opened. A blond man entered, and Aiseline recognized him instantly. Beside him, Rayo tried to hide his face, clearly injured.
The newcomer, Valerian, greeted everyone with a calm smile. Aiseline returned the greeting with a courteous gesture. Valerian then dismissed Rayo, saying they would talk later. However, the young apprentice watched the scene with a sharp look. The two men turned, seeming not to notice the boy's attention. The young apprentice's distrust increased. It was then that he saw the maid in the background, crying silently. That image confirmed that something was very wrong there. Shortly after, the young man and Aiseline finally sat down for the meeting with her father. With a confident smile, Aiseline introduced her companion. Her father, the Duke, analyzed them with a serious and calculating gaze. With the brief introduction over, the pair prepared to leave. However, as they were leaving, the Duke's voice echoed through the hall, ordering the young man to stay. Derek turned around, caught off guard by the unexpected summon. Time passed.
The Duke drafted a document, sealing some kind of agreement or permission. Moments later, Derek found himself alone with the nobleman. The young man sat down, waiting for what would come next. The Duke then began a conversation, questioning the young man's qualifications. He removed his glasses, and his gaze became even sharper. The man seemed to see through any lie or modesty. Derek understood that humility would not be well received here. Suddenly, an overwhelming aura of power emanated from the Duke, testing the young man's courage. Even under the immense pressure, Derek stood firm and reaffirmed his commitment to the mission. The Duke pondered the young man's response, but decided not to dwell on the matter any further. Derek, in turn, confidently explained that his mission was a duty he intended to fulfill to the end. The nobleman lowered his gaze, still processing the unusual determination of that mercenary. Even so, he couldn't understand why, of all people, a commoner like Derek had been chosen for such an important task. The Duke expressed his doubt, questioning how a commoner could adapt to the job of tutoring a noble. Derek, however, had a sincere request to make. He needed the Duke to understand the gravity of the situation so that his work could have any chance of success. The nobleman listened carefully, his expression serious and analytical. The young mercenary held his gaze, awaiting the response. The conversation then turned to the behavior of the young lady Diela. A recent incident was recalled, where a plate was thrown violently. The noblewoman's fury had been sparked by a small mistake by a maid. The maid, terrified, begged Miss Diela for forgiveness. The fear on her face revealed the routine of terror that the servants faced. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the reason for Derek's choice was explained in a calmer conversation.
In a private room, the conversation delved deeper into the reasons for the hiring. After so many famous masters failed, the strategy needed to change. All the most renowned mages on the continent had already tried and given up. The only option left was to look for someone in desperate circumstances. The man pondered the choice. A mercenary for such a delicate task was, without a doubt, a risk. However, she saw something different in Derek. Despite his past, he demonstrated unusual culture and refinement, probably learned from his former master. The decision was made based on this observation. The Duke agreed with the assessment. He had also noticed this unexpected kindness in the young man. And with that, Derek's fate was sealed. Meanwhile, Derek himself was being led through the corridors of the mansion. Approaching his true challenge, he stopped in front of an imposing door. Behind it, his student awaited him. For a brief moment, he hesitated. But right after that, he gathered his resolve and knocked on the door. He prepared himself for their first meeting, aware of the young noblewoman's reputation. Without waiting for an answer, Derek opened the door and walked in. The young man formally introduced himself, ready to meet the famous Diela Duplen. And the reception was exactly as he might expect. Diela stared at him with an air of superiority and defiance, making it clear who was in charge. Diela's arrogance vanished, replaced by utter shock. Derek stared back at her with a coldness she didn't expect. He would no longer be another tutor she could bend to her will. His mind took him back to a dusty road, to a time that defined him. He remembered a lesson he learned from a traveling companion while wiping the blood from his blade. That man taught him that, for some, respect could only be etched through fear. A harsh philosophy which the young mercenary absorbed in silence. They were words about how to deal with those who refused to listen, words he never forgot. Back in the present, Diela's fury exploded. She couldn't believe his audacity. The initial shock turned into pure indignation, but her fury meant nothing. In an instant, Derek put her in her place. He held her firmly, completely ignoring the young noblewoman's protests. Then, with a frightening calm, Derek laid down the rules. Diela's first lesson would be about consideration and respect. But her reaction wasn't fear. It was a twisted smile, almost of excitement. The young lady's scream, however, echoed through the mansion. The butler and maids rushed in, completely horrified by the scene they found. The butler intervened, questioning the young man's identity and what he had done to the lady of the house. In response, Derek simply pulled out a scroll. He presented it as his only explanation, an official document with the Duke's seal.
The butler examined the paper with his monocle, surprise and sweat running down his face. The contents of the document were clear, and for the young noblewoman, it was completely unbelievable. Later that night, the mansion received an unexpected visit. A furious young nobleman stormed into the hallway, being restrained by his companion. Valerian shouted, looking for the person responsible for the mess with his sister. He found Derek sitting quietly in a room, as if nothing had happened. Blinded by rage, Valerian lunged at the mercenary, but was stopped at the last second. Derek remained impassive throughout the commotion. The companion tried to calm Valerian, reminding him of the consequences his actions could bring to Isoline's position. Reluctantly, the nobleman stepped away, leaving the matter for later. The man who held him back tried to apologize for his friend's behavior, but Derek didn't seem to care. After the tension from earlier, Derek's attention was captured by a sudden sound. Valerian, now calmer, led him down a hallway to a specific room in the mansion. The place brought back the memory of a little girl, sitting on the floor with a frightened expression. Valerian began to tell the story behind that door. He revealed that that was his sister, Diela's room, and that it had remained untouched since she left. The nobleman recalled that Diela loved to paint. He fondly remembered her shyness when showing her drawings, and how she never finished a piece. The girl had a habit of only painting the parts she liked, leaving the rest of the canvas blank. However, Valerian explained that, at some point, something changed, and his sister became obsessed with the family lineage. Derek, surrounded by the unfinished paintings, asked why he was being shown all this. Valerian's intention was to prove that Diela wasn't the despicable child everyone thought she was. He lamented not knowing what transformed her to the point of being expelled from the main house. Examining some books, Derek noticed that the margins were full of notes. Diela hadn't completely given up on magic. In a gesture of desperation, Valerian begged for Derek's help to prevent his sister from being sent to a monastery. The weight of that request fell on Derek. Diela's future, somehow, was now in his hands. Derek delved into Diela's books, searching for any clue that could help. Valerian watched, tense, as the young man seemed to find something important in the notes. The words on the paper evoked a dark memory. A young Diela, cornered by a boy who taunted her with cruel words. Frightened, she turned and ran to the safety of the forest. Panic took over as she fled desperately.
but in her haste, the girl tripped and fell to the ground. Suddenly, a wave of power made her stop. This was impossible. A magical attack whizzed past her face, missing by a hair. Her attacker wasn't finished. He prepared a fire spell, magic far beyond his expected level. The boy savored the moment, reveling in her fear. Diela could only look up, paralyzed by terror. With one last effort, she threw herself to the side to escape. The explosion devastated the spot where she had been a second before. The young girl could hardly believe she had survived that power, but her attacker's gaze showed that the hunt wasn't over yet. With no time to think, young Diela fled through the forest. Fear propelled her, but determination kept her standing. Only a single misstep betrayed her, and the girl fell hard to the ground. Pain and exhaustion hit her all at once, but there was no time for rest. Her pursuer showed no mercy and prepared another attack. A mana arrow cut through the air, heading straight for her. The projectile stuck in the ground, inches from Diela's face. The attacker watched her with a cold tone, noting her impressive speed. Diela could barely breathe, feeling that the end of the chase was near. She got up and continued to run, but knew she couldn't run forever. The boy seemed to enjoy her despair. That's when Diela stopped. If she couldn't run anymore, she would have to fight back. Something inside her changed at that instant. Her opponent sensed the change in attitude and prepared for what was to come. The boy observed the darkness of the forest, the place where the chase had finally come to an end. He reflected on the girl's attitude. She knew she couldn't run anymore, and yet she chose to fight. A memory of her surfaced. A painting she had made herself. A talent that also wasn't considered good enough. To him, it was an admirable decision, but completely useless. With a desperate scream, the young woman used her last strength to attack, but his reaction was immediate and effortless. With a single blow, he not only split the stone, but also threw it to the ground. At that moment, she understood the enormous difference in power between them. Despair took over everything. He acknowledged her courage in fighting back, since she could no longer escape. But his admiration was cold and distant. The girl's strength was depleted. There was nowhere left to run, nor how to fight. The boy then asked if she had any last words before the end. The cold blade was pointed directly at her, sealing her fate. But instead of begging, she defied him. She wouldn't stoop like the mudbloods. With no hope of escaping and refusing to beg, the young woman made her last request. Since she couldn't live with dignity, she preferred to die. The weight of that request left him speechless. Frustration took over Diela. She felt that, no matter how hard she tried, nothing worked. All of her powerlessness focused into a single punch against the ground. Amidst tears, she confronted him, questioning if he really thought she had never tried. The young man, however, remained indifferent to her despair. His words made her collapse. Without her lineage and without her art, she felt she was nothing anymore. Defeated, Diela wondered what she was. After all, the boy decided he had heard enough. He then manifested his mana blade. Diela looked up, accepting her fate. He raised his sword, preparing for the final blow. Tears streamed down as she awaited the inevitable, but the blow never came. Instead, he congratulated her. Despite his rudeness, he recognized that she had, in fact, succeeded. The mana blade dissolved, not against her skin, but against an ice barrier that appeared out of nowhere. Diela looked up, completely confused. The attack had stopped. She was at the center of an explosion of crystals, a power she didn't know she had. It was then that the young woman realized. Looking at her own glowing hands, she understood that the magic was hers. The white-haired boy sheathed his sword. The immediate threat had passed. With unexpected formality, he addressed Lady Diela. She was still shaking, trying to process the turn of events. He then explained that it wasn't exactly magic, but a simple manifestation of mana. Still, he admitted that she had succeeded. His words barely made sense to Diela, who was still in shock. Suddenly, all the accumulated tension, fear, and frustration exploded in a desperate scream. The sound echoed through the forest, but the young man observed everything with a disturbing calm. The night went silent for a moment. After she calmed down, he revealed the cause of her troubles. She belonged to the school of nature. While tending to her wounds, the boy explained that she had been trying to learn the wrong way all along. And for the first time, Diela felt a glimmer of hope. Everything started to make sense. Diela was surprised by the young man's explanation. He, in turn, seemed confident that she was already much better. The boy finished tending to her injuries. The young woman could hardly believe this was real. And indeed, she managed to get up, feeling recovered. However, he warned her that her journey was just beginning. The young man seemed to have his own reasons for all of this. But Diela changed the subject, asking an unexpected question about a painting. He seemed surprised by her question. After the brief conversation, the two decided to go on their way together. In his thoughts, the boy admitted that the painting was, in fact, his masterpiece.
The scene changed to a sunny morning. Diela woke up in her room, remembering what she had learned. She immediately tried to manifest her mana, putting the boy's teachings into practice. A new determination arose in her gaze, and she succeeded. Diela finally manifested her mana. At that moment, one of the housemates was going about her daily tasks. Only upon opening the door, the woman came face to face with the young lady, startling at the scene. The water from the bucket spilled, splashing on the floor right at Diela's feet. The maid panicked, expecting severe punishment for her carelessness. But Diela's reaction was not what she expected. Desperate, the woman threw herself on the floor, begging for forgiveness. Diela just watched the scene in silence, without showing any emotion. The maid couldn't understand why she wasn't being punished. Without saying anything else, Diela simply turned and left, leaving the other maids confused by her attitude. Meanwhile, in another room, Derek was sleeping peacefully, until a loud noise at the door suddenly woke him up. Still sleepy, the boy went to see what was happening. On the other side, Diela awaited him with a clear demand. The man who accompanied her was shocked by the girl's audacity and words. Diela was unyielding. Her demand was clear, and she would not leave without what she wanted. Derek's response, however, was short and blunt. He told him to come back later and slammed the door. The closed door did not intimidate her. Diela just smiled, showing that the conversation was not over yet. The butler, seeing the young woman's new attitude, couldn't contain his emotion. Outside, the girl began to bang on the door, demanding that he teach her immediately. Without caring about the screams, Derek simply went back to bed and fell asleep. Meanwhile, back at the family mansion, an argument was unfolding. One of the sons was trying to convince his father not to jump to conclusions about his sister's magic manifestation. The father, however, disagreed. To him, the fact that his sister had manifested magic was a cause for pride, not caution. Down the hallways, the maids gossiped about the latest events. They fell silent when the young man passed them, but he had already heard enough. The boy stopped suddenly.
He overheard their conversation. They were saying that the girl's magic manifestation was too small to save her from being sent to the convent. The decision seemed to have already been formalized. The discussion continued in the patriarch's office. The father questioned his son, asking if he was sulking about the situation. The family leader maintained his firm stance, not swayed by the arguments. The young man raised his face, correcting his father. He wasn't sulking, but angry. The young noble retorted, insisting that his frustration was genuine anger, not just a whim. But the family patriarch remained impassive, not convinced by his son's arguments. The boy tried to insist, but his words were cut off before they even began. For the family leader, the decision had already been formalized, and the matter was closed. Meanwhile, in another room, the young girl waited, visibly upset by the whole situation. That's when the white-haired boy found her and confronted her about her attitude.
He tried to explain that, no matter how much she pouted, there was nothing they could do to change what had been decided. The girl, however, exploded. She corrected the young man, stating that she wasn't pouting, but angry. Her outburst, however, didn't seem to move him at all. Realizing that the discussion wouldn't get her anywhere, the girl finally gave in, admitting that maybe she was just throwing a tantrum. Faced with her surrender, the boy finally seemed to change his mind. He decided that her rest was over. It was time to start magic manifestation training. The sudden shift to proper magic teacher mode didn't please the girl at all. Her sarcasm, however, activated a darker side of the young man. He then suggested a slightly different teaching method. He began to talk about an alternative path, explaining that her natural talent would be perfect for a more free and chaotic learning style.
Despite Derek's words about her talent, Diela let out a tired sigh. The whole idea seemed more exhausting than exciting. To prove his point, the young man began to demonstrate the flow of mana. He explained that if she could get the magic to flow out of her body, the rest would be easy. Diela, however, remained skeptical and crossed her arms, unconvinced. Derek just stared at her, hoping she would understand the simplicity of what he was asking. A little embarrassed but determined, the girl concentrated to try. And to her own surprise, she succeeded. Something finally happened. Outside, the two's conversation was being observed, although they had no idea. Meanwhile, the young noble was approaching the mansion. Deep in thought about the matter of magic manifestation, the mere mention of the topic filled him with deep frustration. The next day, the routine in the mansion changed completely. Diela, now able to manifest magic, didn't leave Derek alone for a single second.
She interrupted him at every moment, complaining that the sensation of magic felt strange. The boy tried to ignore her and continue with his chores, but Diela and the maid chased him all over the house. He sought refuge outside to read in peace, but the girl was relentless, determined to show her progress. Diela finally caught up to him, demanding his attention, but Derek remained focused on his reading, ignoring the commotion. The girl insisted she had managed to use magic as he taught her, and that he needed to check right now. Later, in one of the mansion's halls, The young noble waited in silence. Suddenly, the door opened. Derek had arrived for the meeting. After sitting down, the noble got straight to the point, asking about Dila. Derek lowered his gaze, pondering the answer. The noble then shared his concerns. He warned him that his mother, who would soon return, was not an easy person to deal with. Derek listened to the warning in silence, but the main subject was another. The noble stood up, and the conversation took an unexpected turn. He confessed that the real reason for that meeting was to ask for help in regaining Diela's favor. Derek just watched the outburst, showing no reaction. The young noble, in a gesture of despair, tried to explain why he needed Derek's help so much. He confessed that Derek was the only person Diela really paid attention to. Derek, however, didn't seem even slightly moved by the appeal. While the noble continued his dramatic speech, the young apprentice just drank his tea, completely indifferent. Seeing that his appeal wasn't working, the noble changed tactics, visibly shaken. He approached, ready to present a new proposal. Meanwhile, in another part of the property, a young woman was looking for Derek. Back in the hall, the noble revealed what he had in his hands. It was a doll that he had made himself, hoping it would look like Diela. Derek's reaction was pure sarcasm, questioning whether it was a gift or an attempt at a curse. The noble was devastated by the response, lamenting his guest's total lack of cooperation. Later, Derek arrived at the Duplain family mansion. He was greeted by the servants and the matriarch of the house, who was already waiting for him. The woman watched him with a calculated smile. She then introduced herself as Miriella Duplain, the lady of the house, expressing her satisfaction in finally meeting the new and capable magic teacher. Derek began to speak with a serious expression. Miriella Duplain listened to him, still with the air of superiority of a noble. But then, the young man revealed his true origin, without hesitation. The matriarch was shocked. A commoner. The word echoed in her mind. All of that, however, had started a week before, in the imposing residence of the Grand Duke. That day, Derek was formally received by the lady of the house and her servants.
With a calculated smile, the woman hid her true thoughts. She welcomed Derek, expressing her satisfaction in having him there. But now, back to the present, the tension was palpable. Miriella still seemed not to believe what she had just heard. Derek, however, only confirmed her words with a steady gaze. The noblewoman's composure finally crumbled, revealing her shock and disdain. Outside the mansion, a carriage waited to depart. A young woman approached Derek to say goodbye. With a gentle smile, she said she was counting on him, entrusting her sister to the young man's care. Derek listened to the young woman's request with a serious expression. An older man noticed the young man's attitude and encouraged him to be a little more optimistic. The couple then said their goodbyes, departing in the carriage. And so, Derek was left behind, alone in front of the imposing mansion. Inside the carriage, however, the woman was shocked to learn the new tutor's true origins.
She could hardly believe the news. The man tried to explain his decision, admitting that hiring a commoner wasn't his preference either. Meanwhile, in another room of the residence, the doors burst open. An older woman rushed in. She went straight to confront the man sitting at the table, interrupting his work. The man with glasses, however, remained calm in the face of the sudden interruption. The matriarch exploded, outraged by the decision to hire a commoner. Tired of that discussion, the man removed his glasses. She reminded him that all the other tutors of noble lineage had already given up on that task. Even so, he listened to her in silence, impassive to her arguments. In the Grand Duke's office, the family matriarch was expressing her complete disapproval. The idea of a commoner as a tutor was an outrage she could barely process. The Grand Duke, however, listened to the protests with unwavering calm. She exploded, worried about her daughter's reputation in high society. The matriarch accused him directly, furious with the decision he had made. Suddenly, the office door opened. The couple's blond son entered, trying to appease the heated discussion. His mother, however, didn't seem willing to listen. The young man then approached, offering a solution to the impasse. He proposed personally testing the qualities of the commoner mage, which seemed to intrigue the matriarch. It was then that the other son, Valerian, stepped forward with a counter-proposal. He suggested that, instead of testing the tutor, they should evaluate the training results directly with the student. The Grand Duke listened to his son's suggestion, pondering the new idea. Valerian, however, seemed to doubt that his sister had really changed. In front of his father, he questioned whether blood ties were enough to justify the protection they gave her. The blond brother was perplexed by Valerian's hostility. But Valerian didn't back down, insisting that his sister was the real threat to the family. The Grand Duke listened to his son's harsh words, feeling the weight of that accusation. Without giving him a chance to reply, Valerian walked straight past his brother, ignoring his protests. The blond young man still tried to argue, questioning if that's what Valerian really felt. But his brother's mind was already made up. He reminded everyone that Diela was the first to cross the line, and in his opinion, The best thing for her was to remain isolated in the annex. Valerian exploded, yelling that if she debuted in high society, it would be the end of them all. His brother stared at him with a serious and resolute expression. Valerian then turned his back and withdrew. The silence that remained in the room was heavy. The proposal for a magic duel was made, and the consequences would be unavoidable. A week passed. On the appointed day, the young woman went to look for her teacher, Derek.
Diela found her teacher Derek immersed in his studies. She then placed a scroll over the book he was reading. The young man unrolled the document, while the girl watched him, visibly displeased. Suddenly she exploded, questioning his true intentions. A week later, on the day of the duel, the nobility gathered at the agreed location. The Grand Duke, Diela's father, arrived with his entourage, wearing a serious expression. In the distance, he spotted Derek, who was waiting for him with unexpected calm. The young man greeted the nobleman respectfully, without showing any nervousness. The Grand Duke sat down, impressed by the boy's confidence, and reflected that he was not someone to be discarded. At that moment, Diela's opponent made his entrance. He was determined to make his sister regret that duel. The nobleman climbed the steps of the arena, ready for the confrontation. Back to the previous conversation, Diela seemed shaken by her teacher's words.
She stared at him, trying to understand what he was saying. In a sincere appeal, she insisted that she wanted to continue learning magic with him, and with no one else. Derek responded to her appeal with words she did not expect to hear. Shocked, Diela didn't understand the reason for that refusal. As he prepared to leave, she questioned him, desperately. But the young teacher's expression remained firm. His decision was made. His answer led her to a cry of anguish. The feeling of being abandoned once again was simply overwhelming. Without looking back, Derek left her alone with her pain. However, that wasn't a goodbye. He was preparing for something different. With an intense look, the teacher revealed his true intentions. He forced her to remember the gossip, the voices that said that even the most famous teachers had given up on her. Derek made her confront the memories of a lonely childhood, surrounded by those who despised her and saw her family as decadent.
But instead of breaking her spirit, those cruel words ignited a new flame in Diela's eyes. Sadness gave way to a new resolution. The young mage accepted the challenge. Derek observed the change in his student. She was no longer the girl who cried over abandonment. Now, she was a mage ready to fight. Diela entered the arena, not as the youngest of House Duplain, but just as Derek's student. A man announced the start of the duel. Time began to run. Raig, Diela's opponent, faced the young woman confidently. Diela, however, showed no fear. She was ready for whatever came. To protect himself, Raig relied on a very expensive magical accessory, capable of nullifying a powerful spell. From afar, Derek watched his student, aware of everything that was at stake. Without wasting time, Raig began his attack, conjuring his magic. Diela responded in kind, preparing a counterattack. Raig realized that, although she had talent, she was a complete beginner in real combat. He then cast a powerful spell, hoping to end the fight quickly. But Diela remained still, waiting for the attack to approach. Her eyes shone with unwavering concentration. At the last instant, she dodged with surprising agility. The ease with which she dodged made him angry. He noticed that she was spending a lot of mana, a rookie mistake. Underestimating her defense, Raig decided he would simply crush her with brute power. Raig, annoyed, decided to crush her with brute power, launching a massive attack. From afar, an observer analyzed the fight, judging Diela as a complete beginner. However, the girl responded by raising an immense barrier of ice to defend herself. Her opponent didn't seem impressed with the defensive maneuver. He prepared a new attack, confident that he could simply break the barrier with full force. Victory seemed certain for him. With a shout, he challenged Diela to block his next blow. At that moment, Diela remembered some advice she received, a lesson about the difference between the fighting of nobles and that of mercenaries. The idea of fighting dishonorably made her visibly uncomfortable, but the young man insisted that, for a mercenary, the only thing that mattered was victory, not the method. His words awakened a new determination in the girl. Back in the present, that determination hardened her gaze. She was no longer in a duel. She was in a fight. Diela abandoned her defensive stance and began to run. Using the terrain to her advantage, she moved with a new purpose, turning the battlefield into her own weapon. But suddenly, something in the middle of her advance caught her completely by surprise. Caught by surprise, Diela stood firm on the ground, preparing for what was coming next. Suddenly, a ring of cutting energy was fired in her direction. The attack collided with force, shattering a barrier that appeared out of nowhere.
It was her defense. With visible effort, Diela had conjured the protection at the last second. Her opponent gritted his teeth, frustrated that his blow had been blocked. However, Diela's shocked look indicated that something else had happened. And indeed, a second attack hit her, throwing her violently backwards. From afar, a young man with white hair watched the scene with a serious and analytical look. In the audience, Diela's fall caused a stir. One noblewoman in particular seemed horrified by the outcome of that confrontation. Beside her, a man with an imposing beard maintained his composure. The woman turned to him, insisting that Diela had clearly been hit by the attack. But the man remained impassive, listening to the protest without showing any reaction. The young observer, however, continued to analyze the arena, and then he seemed to understand the truth behind that play. There was a loophole in the rules. The young observer, who until then had only analyzed, decided to intervene. He had understood the loophole in the rules and wouldn't stand idly by. But as he approached the edge of the platform, a surprise awaited him. Without hesitation, he jumped to the lower level. Only an ice attack came out of nowhere, hitting him squarely. The impact threw him back, forcing him to brace himself to avoid falling. The humiliation and pain of the blow ignited his fury. Suddenly, he noticed the presence of an authority figure watching the duel. The older man, however, seemed to completely ignore the irregularity of the situation. The young man protested, questioning how an attack coming from outside the platform could be considered valid. But there was no time to discuss the rules. Another ice stake erupted from the ground, forcing him to retreat. The offensive was relentless, surrounding him on all sides. The boy could hardly believe it. This fight didn't follow any noble etiquette. It was then that he realized something. That calm look from his opponent. He had seen it before. He looked at the hole that opened in the ground. Suddenly, Diela emerged from within it, glaring at him furiously. Her eyes shone with an intensity he didn't expect. The noble was caught completely by surprise. But then, he understood. That look, he had seen it on someone else, and suspected that Diela wasn't acting alone. From afar, Derek watched the scene, completely calm. The opponent decided to enter their game. He discarded his cloak, preparing to fight seriously. The young noble prepared his own counterattack. The real battle was about to begin. In the audience, a woman complained about the girl's tactic, which always attacked the feet to interrupt the spells. Beside her, an older man listened attentively. He pondered the information, realizing how this strategy interrupted the opponent's mana flow. Diela, in turn, felt that he was plotting something different. But she prepared herself, determined to attack him as soon as he began the next conjuration. The young master analyzed the distance. He realized that his opponent would be able to react to his mana, making a conventional spell useless. Meanwhile, Derek was forced to retreat under a hail of ice attacks. Frustrated, the young master gritted his teeth. He then made a drastic decision: destroy the entire platform without needing an enchantment. Down below, Derek looked up, surrounded by destruction. Diela watched him, motionless amidst her own ice crystals. The young woman remained focused, awaiting her opponent's next move. From afar, an authority figure watched everything without intervening. The young master then began his plan. Climbing the large flagpole, from the top, he prepared to deliver the blow. The boy concentrated a huge amount of mana in his hand, and released it all at once against the base of the structure. Amidst the chaos, a young man with white hair appeared, watching the scene intently. The impact made the entire platform crack and tremble violently. The shockwave unbalanced Derek, throwing him backward. The attack hit the platform with full force, causing a devastating explosion. The sudden destruction panicked the older woman. Despite the impact, Derek tried to get back on his feet as quickly as he could. He wasn't going to let it go. The humiliation of the blow ignited his fury. Without losing a second, the young man advanced through the dust. But his opponent was already prepared, certain that he had the advantage in close combat. He fired a mana arrow without hesitation. The magic projectile flew straight toward the target. However, at the last instant, someone intervened to block the attack. The magic was dispelled before it even hit Derek. The young woman who protected him didn't seem happy about the situation at all. But the attack didn't stop there. Another magic arrow was already coming in his direction. With no mana left, the girl went for a physical attack, doing everything she could to fight. The boy was impressed. He realized that, even knowing it was impossible, she fought with everything she had just to win. With no magic left, Diela went for a physical attack. The girl used all her strength in the blow. The boy wasn't expecting that. The impact stunned him, feeling the pain of the kick, but Diela didn't give him a second to recover. She grabbed a handful of dirt from the ground and threw it directly in his face. While he was trying to clear his eyes, the young woman took the chance to escape. But her determination had touched him deeply. He recognized that this duel was proof of Diela's worth, and like his brother, he decided he would rise to the occasion. In the distance, Diela watched her opponent get back to his feet. Suddenly, an old lesson about the flow of mana came to her mind. At that moment, she finally understood. The sudden change in energy surprised everyone watching. The mana around Diela began to condense rapidly.
A protective barrier formed, solid and impenetrable. One of the spectators gasped, shocked by what they saw. But Diela remained still, completely focused. The white-haired boy just watched, analyzing his opponent's new technique. At that instant, a distant memory surfaced. She remembered how the first barrier in her life was erected. Her father and the other men in the family watched her from afar. He looked at her with a serious and distant expression. The man saw his own daughter through the crack in the door, isolated and alone. At that time, young Diela didn't understand the reason for that treatment. Her father, in turn, carried a weight he couldn't share. Back in the present, Diela channeled all that pain from the past. A wave of power, greater than anything she had ever released, exploded around her.
That power, once called dirty and vulgar, was now her only hope. Amidst the dust of battle, a young soldier recomposed himself. From afar, a white-haired boy watched the scene with a cold look. He seemed to analyze what he saw, without showing any emotion. Little Diela, on the other hand, couldn't take the pressure and broke down in tears. At a distance, her father watched the result of that magic training. The woman beside him didn't hide her indignation, harshly criticizing what she had just witnessed. The cruel words hit the young girl hard. The father, however, remained silent, with an indecipherable expression. In another time, a young man named Raymond Duplan was reporting for war. An older officer recognized him, commenting on the ambition he saw in his eyes, a trait inherited from his father. Raymond listened to the words seriously, his determination visible. Back in the past, Diela's pain was palpable.
Despite the situation, her father noticed that something in his daughter's eyes had changed. The maids rushed to her aid, worried about the young lady's condition. They tried to comfort her, offering to take her away from that humiliating situation. The maid tried to help Diela withdraw, worried about the young girl's state. But Diela stopped suddenly, ignoring the request. The man in front of her seemed tense about the situation. He tried to congratulate her on her effort. But Diela just lowered her head, ashamed of the result. The other maids watched the scene, shocked by their lady's humiliation. Without saying a word, Diela turned and walked away. She went directly to meet the white-haired boy who was waiting for her. He watched her approach with a cold and impassive look. Before him, all of Diela's composure began to crumble. The frustration and pain of defeat finally overwhelmed her. She clutched at her dress, trying to contain her emotions. The young man then advised her to use that frustration to become stronger. He stared at her seriously, waiting for a response. And then, in an unexpected gesture, the boy knelt before her. He comforted her, saying it was okay to lose. The young apprentice encouraged her to use that experience to become stronger. Diela was speechless, completely overcome with emotion. She finally broke down, releasing all the pain and fear she felt. The scene caught the attention of the maids, who watched from afar. Suddenly, firm footsteps echoed through the place. A lady approached, interrupting the moment. She knelt before Diela, expressing how much she had missed her. The two hugged tightly in a reunion full of emotion. Diela finally felt safe in that woman's arms. As the maids took the young woman away, the lady watched them, still processing what she saw. She wiped away a tear, relieved to have found her girl. The young apprentice just watched the scene unfold in silence.
But then, the lady started walking towards him. The boy stared at her, not understanding what was happening. To his surprise, the woman exploded in fury, accusing him of corrupting the young noble. The young apprentice tried to defend himself from the sudden accusation, but the lady grabbed him, full of fury, and without hesitation, she attacked him. The woman screamed, accusing him of teaching her daughter terrible things. She then turned to her husband, seeking support for her allegations. However, the reaction she received shocked her. The man intervened, holding his wife's arm to stop her. The woman was speechless, completely shaken. The master of the property then took control of the situation. The young apprentice just waited in silence, head down. The man addressed the boy with a serious expression. The young teacher looked up, attentive to the noble's words. The man then turned, indicating that the conversation was not over yet. While the two walked away, the lady watched the scene, in disbelief. Humiliation and anger took over her. The conversation began in an imposing office. The noble was direct, with an air of authority. He questioned the young man about his magic. The young apprentice stared at the man, without showing any hesitation. Tension filled the silence between the two. The boy confirmed the nobleman's suspicions with a single word. The man mentioned the rules of high society, but the apprentice realized that he already knew his true ambitions. That realization made the nobleman an even more intimidating figure. And, as if reading his thoughts, the man stated that the young man didn't intend to stay there for long. He made it clear that he knew the boy's ambition. The nobleman spoke about the limit imposed on commoners, and how the young man intended to challenge the power of the nobles. With his plans exposed, the apprentice remained silent. Then, the man began to write, preparing his proposal. He looked up, with a calculating expression. The nobleman made a proposal that caught Derek's attention, the chance to obtain 3-star magic. The man explained that many spent their entire lives trying to get a single spell of that level. But for Derek, the offer was all 13 books. More than enough reason for him to stay on that property. With the decision made, the library door opened. Derek wasted no time and went straight to look for the knowledge that had been promised to him. He soon found one of the grimoires. The pages revealed spells and symbols of a power he had never seen. The young man immersed himself in study, absorbing every detail. However, progress was slow and frustrating. The power contained on those shelves seemed immense and out of reach. Even though he had managed to use 1-star magic, he felt it wasn't his own achievement.
The journey to becoming a true mage would be more arduous than he imagined. Far away, the master of the property was talking to an attendant, who seemed confused by his reaction. Meanwhile, a message was sent, marking the beginning of a new chapter. The young woman introduced herself, full of pride and expecting recognition. The young man with white hair only commented that, technically, she could now be called a 1-star mage. His reaction, so indifferent, infuriated the girl. It wasn't the praise she expected. Her frustration soon turned to confusion. She didn't understand why he didn't seem happy with her progress. Suddenly, a feeling of shame took over the girl. She remained silent, sulking, while the young man continued his reading as if nothing had happened. The apprentice tried to hide it, but her expression gave away all her dissatisfaction. He was the one who broke the silence, suggesting it was time to start the lesson.
The simple mention of a lesson changed her mood completely. The young man, however, did not share the same enthusiasm. Excited, she began to list all the advanced spells she wanted to learn first. He just watched, listening to the apprentice's suggestions with a neutral expression. The girl finished her list, confident that they would start with something incredible. The instructor seemed to ponder for a moment before giving his answer. Only his decision wasn't what she wanted to hear. The girl agreed, completely discouraged. The young woman was surprised by his proposal. She tried to understand the reason behind this unexpected lesson. The girl then confronted him, reminding him of an unpleasant incident from the past. Derek's response only made her angrier. The memory was clear, her, with a victorious smile, pouring a bucket of water over his head. Back in the present, the practice didn't go as expected, leaving the young woman completely frustrated.
Feeling humiliated, the girl decided to leave. She ran off without even looking back. Later that night, the situation changed. The young woman didn't give up and continued training alone, exhausted but determined. Suddenly Derek appeared, watching her efforts. He commented that her schedule would get even busier. He approached, and the two talked about her future. In an unexpected gesture, Derek touched the young woman's head, taking her by surprise. He explained that, in addition to magic, she would have to undergo rigorous nobility training. The girl questioned the need for all of this, feeling the weight of her new responsibilities. Derek listened to the girl's concerns, pondering her situation. Under the starry sky, he then proposed a direct solution to the problem. The young teacher knew she had her doubts, especially about who might oppose her. The young woman listened carefully, a slight smile appearing as she understood the logic behind the plan. But when Derek explained the details of how they would do it, the reality of the method shocked her. He remained silent for a moment, aware that his ideas were, to say the least, unusual. The pressure was too much for Diela, who couldn't hold back her tears. Then, with a new determination, Derek declared that he would teach her the mercenary way of solving things. The unexpected proposal caught the girl by surprise, making her stop crying. And so, a new day began on the family's imposing estate. Inside, the matriarch of the house, Diela's mother, waited with an expression of total disapproval. She worried about the influence of that teacher on her daughter, imagining the worst possible scenarios. Meanwhile, Derek's class had already begun in a very practical way. And then, to everyone's astonishment, Diela returned to the mansion, not as a lady, but as a huntress. She went directly to her mother, with a smile that sent a clear message. Things had changed. Had the doors of the mansion opened for a visit. Just the thought of this meeting gave Diela's mother a headache. However, she maintained her composure, and spoke with the young noblewoman, who apologized for having to leave soon for her lesson. The matriarch said goodbye with a warm smile, praising the girl's poise. But as soon as the young woman turned around, her smile began to fade. Joy gave way to deep melancholy. The comparison with her own daughter was too painful. It was then that, out of nowhere, another person appeared. Diela's mother looked up, completely surprised. It was Diela, greeting her with an elegance she would never have expected to see. The matriarch froze, unsure how to react. Diela gave an impeccable bow, confirming it wasn't her imagination. Confused, her mother inquired about etiquette lessons, certain they hadn't started yet. Diela's transformation was so shocking that all the employees stopped what they were doing. One of the maids, in shock, even dropped the books she was carrying. A young noblewoman, concerned about the commotion, asked the maid if she was all right. The maid, however, was still in shock from the scene she had just witnessed. The matriarch then decided to intervene, leading her guest away from there. Elsewhere, the story of Diela's sudden transformation was already beginning to spread, and during afternoon tea, it became the main topic of conversation. Denise Veltus could hardly believe the rumors she was hearing. She and the Belmiard house's daughter were excitedly commenting on the news. The red-haired young woman listened intently, impressed by the reports about Diela's new posture. Denise continued the story, clearly pleased with her friend's reaction. The Belmiard's daughter, however, began to ponder about the figure behind such a drastic change. The tutor. The conversation then turned to Diela herself, who was present at the table. The subject was so interesting that even the nearby maids stopped to listen to the gossip. While the others spoke, Diela only listened in silence, with unwavering calm. She remembered all the effort and dedication that had brought her to that moment. Denise, in turn, cast a sly glance, knowing that the most surprising part of the story was yet to come. One of the young women explained that her tutor, Derek, was also helping her with etiquette lessons. Upon hearing that name again, Diela's mother felt her patience wearing thin. She tried to hide her irritation as she sipped her tea. The matriarch remembered how even the employees were commenting on Diela's sudden change. However, the name of that tutor wouldn't leave her head. The mere mention of him was enough to sour her mood. She then changed the subject, asking the young women about the difficulties of studying on their own. Diela's mother maintained a polite smile, hiding her true thoughts. The black-haired girl responded with a compliment, mentioning how Diela had become kind to everyone. In another part of the mansion, a young noblewoman was also telling a lady about Diela's transformation. The older woman listened attentively, impressed by the reports about the girl's new dignity. The conversation between the two flowed smoothly in the hall. The young blonde laughed as she shared another detail about Diela's recent behavior. The lady smiled back, finding the story charming, until a revelation left her completely speechless. In a state of shock, the lady was horrified to discover what had happened to Diela. Meanwhile, the mansion's employees were commenting on the young woman's recent change. Everyone seemed to notice the new dignity she displayed. Even the butler pondered that Diela was finally behaving like a true lady. However, this transformation left someone else completely furious. Far away, night fell over the forest.
A young man studied an ancient and complex spellbook. The effort to control the magic was visible on his face. He focused, gathering all his energy at his fingertips. The pressure of the power was almost unbearable. And then, the young man finally released the spell. The result left him completely exhausted, collapsed on the ground. After so much effort, he observed the small result of his magic. Suddenly, a voice interrupted him, and a familiar figure approached. The young man turned, surprised by the unexpected visit. Night had fallen over the forest. Under the starry sky, the conversation between Derek and the uniformed man soon turned to Diela. Derek showed a book, but the content seemed to leave his companion somewhat confused. The uniformed man was visibly shaken by what he saw. Derek, in turn, maintained his calm and unreadable expression. The conversation reminded him of his father's feelings, who seemed satisfied lately, although he didn't show it. The uniformed man, however, admitted that it was difficult to read the Duke's emotions. He seemed discouraged, feeling that everyone in the mansion would agree with that difficulty. Trying to change the subject, he asked awkwardly about what teenage girls like. Derek just watched, waiting to see where that conversation would lead. The man then suggested the idea of giving Diela an embroidered doll, looking anxious about the possibility. Except the image that came to mind wasn't exactly pleasant. Derek's answer was a very direct no. The uniformed man seemed relieved by the honesty, agreeing that the idea wasn't good. He then reflected aloud. If Diela had changed, maybe he needed to change too. After the conversation, the two walked through the garden in silence for a moment. Under the night sky, the uniformed man continued to organize his thoughts aloud. He turned to Derek with a slight smile, seeming to have reached an important conclusion.
The man expressed his gratitude, crediting Derek for his new perspective, while the young man just watched. Suddenly, he stopped walking, looking at the starry sky. The man stated that people really could change. He admitted to himself that perhaps he had been avoiding that truth for too long. Derek listened to everything with a serious expression, processing the man's words. The guard then changed the subject, commenting on the peculiar nature of Diela's magic. Derek reflected in silence, thinking that the nature of the man's family was something that did not change. The man continued to speak, oblivious to the thoughts of the young man beside him. His words, however, seemed to catch Derek's attention. They resumed walking, with the uniformed man still leading the way. The conversation about Diela's potential continued under the night sky. And so, 2 months passed. 2 months later, young Iselin was living happier days, something the maid noticed immediately.
The girl enjoyed the scent of the flowers, a small luxury that was now part of her routine. She felt that, in that time, she had grown much closer to the mansion's servants, and, for her, all this positive change had only one person to thank, Derek. With a heart full of gratitude, Aislinn asked for one of the flowers to give him as a gift. But suddenly, the small gesture of affection was interrupted. Aislinn stopped in the middle of the hallway, completely paralyzed by what she saw. Shock and sadness took over her face, and tears began to well up. There he was. Derek was at the door of her room, accompanied by another man. The young man's expression was serious and distant, something she had never seen before. It was then that she heard a cold explanation. Like winter, spring doesn't last forever either. As it turns out, in his office, the master of the house had informed Derek that Lady Aislinn's stay was coming to an end.
And with her departure, he gave a direct order to the young man. The library key should be returned. Derek tried to argue, but the man was unyielding, demanding its immediate return. The decision was final. Any bond between the young man and the girl would be cut right there. The master of the house's order was unyielding. Having said what he needed to, he dismissed the young man without even looking at him. For the older man, the matter was closed. Derek remained silent, feeling small in the face of that unwavering authority. There was nothing he could say or do. A heavy silence filled the office, and the distance between the two became an abyss. The master of the house remained with his back turned, ignoring the boy's presence. It was then that Derek, gathering his strength, finally responded. He agreed to return the key, but proposed to deliver it through the head butler after organizing the books. It was a last attempt to maintain a minimum of dignity.
The Duke, however, did not allow even that. Defeated, Derek withdrew from the office and walked down the empty hallway. But as he turned, he found someone he didn't expect. Lady Aisling was there, waiting for him. She stared at him, with something important to say. Diela listened to his words, not knowing what to answer. Derek explained his plans to return to the life of a mercenary. He promised that they would meet again in the future, when they were both stronger. The young woman lowered her gaze, frustrated at not having arguments against his logic. Derek, however, seemed confident in his decision. Diela just watched, accepting the imminent farewell. Later that night, the mansion was silent under the moonlight. But Diela's sleep was not peaceful. A nightmare took her back to the past, where voices haunted her, calling her useless and incompetent. She saw herself again as a frightened child, unable to react. Suddenly, the young woman awoke. The terror of the dream made her scream in denial. She sat up in bed, panting and disoriented. The girl's heart was pounding, still feeling the weight of those memories. The sudden noise caught the attention of a maid, who rushed into the room, worried. The young woman looked at the maid who had just entered, still shaken by the nightmare. The fear of what she saw in her dream was still fresh in her mind. The maid, in turn, seemed genuinely concerned about the girl's condition. But the young woman lowered her head, making a firm decision at that moment. She then communicated her thoughts to the maid, who listened in surprise. Her determination was unwavering. The employee was shocked by what she had just heard. The young lady, however, smiled to reassure her, insisting that there was no reason to worry. And so, the day of departure finally arrived. A white-haired boy prepared to enter the carriage, confirming the details of the trip with his companion. The girl inside the vehicle agreed with a smile. The young man, however, seemed thoughtful, with his mind elsewhere. Outside the mansion, the residents gathered for the farewell. The boy introduced himself before the group, while the young blonde girl watched the scene, visibly upset. The two men in uniform, however, offered smiles of encouragement. The white-haired boy listened in silence, with a pensive air. Then, he looked up, his expression changing subtly. Before him, Diela maintained a defensive posture, with her arms crossed. The girl seemed to be trying to convince him of something. She got a little excited, insisting on her point of view. The boy gave a slight smile, seeming to understand her stubbornness. Diela, in turn, smiled confidently, certain that she was right. But the young man watched her with a calmness she did not expect. His words, however, caught her completely by surprise. The girl's confidence disappeared, giving way to visible embarrassment. Diela didn't know how to react. Her insistence on saying that she could already take care of herself made him remember when he himself considered himself an adult. A memory of his own farewell came to mind, a time when he also received a take-care hug, full of an affection that he did not fully understand at the time. That stubbornness reminded him of his own farewell. Diela, however, did not understand the sudden change in his gaze. Instead of arguing, Derek just offered a gentle gesture and a promise to meet again. That simple act of affection was enough to break the girl's armor. As he turned to leave, Diela struggled to hold back tears. Derek also felt the weight of that moment, but the young woman mustered her strength for a cheerful farewell. She kept waving as he walked away. A sad but hopeful smile formed on her face. Meanwhile, in the Ebelstein commercial district, life went on relentlessly. The sound of a fight came from inside an alley. Someone was being beaten mercilessly. Derek arrived on the scene just in time to see it unfold. The aggressors didn't seem to have the slightest intention of stopping, and to his surprise, the person leading the attack was a young woman who seemed to be enjoying the situation. Derek had returned from his mission, and apparently it had been a success. He went straight to the Belden Tear Tavern, the usual meeting place. His companions greeted him, and while the tavern keeper offered a drink on the house, the young woman wanted to know about the payment. Derek, however, revealed that he had obtained something far more important than money. His companion didn't seem at all impressed with the mysterious answer. Despite the teasing, the atmosphere between them was one of camaraderie. Derek took a sip of his drink, savoring the moment before the big reveal. The girl, however, was already losing patience with all the suspense. Exasperated, she demanded to see what he had gotten that was so special. The tavern keeper just watched the scene, amused by the young woman's impatience. With an air of mystery, Derek prepared to show the reward. And then he placed the item on the table. An ancient, sealed book. The reaction was immediate. The young woman and the tavern keeper could hardly believe what they were seeing. Derek just watched them, aware of the value of the object he held in his hands. When the book was opened, a powerful light emanated from its pages, leaving the two completely shocked. It was a 3-star grimoire. Faced with the accusation of theft, Derek calmly clarified the origin of the item. It was a gift from the Duke himself. Suddenly, a peculiar memory of his companion came to Derek's mind. Hours passed. Back in the present, the young man immersed himself in the studies of the grimoire, while the girl, exhausted, slept on the counter. He soon realized that mastering the 3-star spells would be a monumental challenge. The tavern keeper, watching the two, commented with admiration on the recent and dangerous journey they had completed. Derek just listened, recalling the events of that trip. The journey to the Kent Mountains had not been easy at all. They faced dangers that tested their limits at every step. But in the end, the pair managed to overcome the monsters that crossed their path, and the challenges seemed to never end, forcing them to constantly fight for survival. The trip was especially exhausting for the young warrior. They barely had time to rest during the journey, but while his partner slept, Derek used the cover of night to train nonstop. He strived to completely master the spells he already knew. The goal was clear: to break through the barrier to the next level of power. The relentless training finally paid off. With a burst of power, the magic barrier finally shattered. But the breakthrough came at a cost. Leaving Derek exhausted and injured, he had underestimated the power contained within that ancient grimoire. Time passed, and the seasons changed, until one cold winter night arrived at Belden's Tear Tavern. That's when the door burst open. Derek and his companion returned, exhausted and covered in wounds from their latest mission. They handed over the proof of their work to the tavern keeper. The man was impressed by the courage of the young people for facing the mountains in that weather. The journey had been brutal for both of them, but before they could even rest, the tavern keeper revealed he had a new request perfect for Derek. He described the mission as something easy and very lucrative. Without wasting any time, the young man set off for his new job. Derek was focused, ready to face whatever came his way. And so, Derek arrived at the location of his new job. Inside, a young noblewoman was walking with her master. The young woman questioned the nature of her next training, a fight against a commoner. She didn't seem convinced that it would be useful. The master, however, seemed quite pleased with the arrangement. The noblewoman, in turn, remained skeptical about the usefulness of facing someone so below her level. After all, she was about to become a 2-star mage. Meanwhile, the commoner hired for the job was preparing. It was Derek. Suddenly, the arrival of someone caught his attention. The noblewoman introduced herself, confirming that Derek was her training opponent for that day. The young man introduced himself formally, with a bow. His name sounded familiar to the noblewoman, who tried to remember where she knew him from. With introductions made, the group headed to the training arena. Arriving there, the mage began to warm up, ready for the fight. She then gave Derek a single instruction: that he resist as much as he could, as she intended to end this quickly. Derek listened to the noblewoman attentively. She, in turn, reinforced her order with an air of superiority, telling him to resist with everything he had. Her confidence, however, was shaken for a moment. Derek responded unexpectedly, commenting on the way she spoke. The young man's audacity left her momentarily speechless, but he didn't seem to care about her opinion. The old master simply nodded, signaling that the fight could begin. The noblewoman regained her composure, and with a confident smile, she prepared for the fight.
To everyone's surprise, it was Derek who took the initiative, conjuring his magic. He launched the first attack without hesitation. The mage recognized the commoner's skill, but still believed in the vast difference in power between them. To defend herself, she activated a magical artifact on her brooch. The item released a powerful barrier that repelled Derek's spell, but the young apprentice was not intimidated by the display of power.
Derek's spell exploded forcefully against the barrier. The young noble was surprised by the power of the attack. Derek, however, seemed to already expect that result. Her irritation grew as she realized she had underestimated her opponent. The mage decided it was time to take the fight seriously. She conjured a rain of magical arrows, preparing her counterattack, and then she fired them all in the direction of the young apprentice. Derek, however, reacted with impressive calm, preparing his own magic. What he did next left the noble completely shocked. With a single movement, the boy deflected all the arrows at once. Her attack was completely neutralized. The mage was forced to admit to herself that the level of magical control of that commoner was impressive. From afar, the old master watched the unfolding fight with a satisfied look. Realizing that direct attacks would not work, the noble changed her strategy. This time, she began to conjure a large-scale spell, with the intention of destroying the entire arena. Derek watched the mage conjure her large-scale spell. He had to admit to himself that her talent was truly impressive. The young man braced himself for the impact. A rain of magical projectiles fell on the arena, forcing Derek to retreat. The mage watched the destruction, confident in her victory. But amidst the smoke, the apprentice prepared his own attack, an ice spear at point-blank range. Suddenly, he felt something. The noble appeared right in front of him, faster than he could predict. Her blow grazed him. Derek barely had time to react to the surprise attack. The mage stepped back, confused as to why she hadn't hit her target squarely. She tried to sense his presence, but the apprentice had simply disappeared. The young noble was furious, not understanding where he had gone. Only then did she realize an ice spear was pointed directly at her face. She finally understood his strategy. He had used illusion magic to nullify the sound, knowing that she relied on hearing to fight. The mage braced herself, determined to manifest her own magic first and end this. Only his attack came from an unexpected direction, forcing her to defend at the last second. Then, with impressive calm, Derek paralyzed the flow of battle. The young noblewoman was indignant at the apprentice's audacity. Seeing an opening, she decided it was her chance to turn the tables. Derek seemed to be in a vulnerable position on the ground, but it was just another bait in his plan. The mage felt the change in the flow of mana too late. She realized in shock that he wasn't manifesting the magic with his hands. Derek released his power directly from the ground, through his feet. A wave of electrical energy swept across the battlefield. The attack caught her by surprise, throwing her backward.
From afar, the old master watched the confrontation, impressed with his student's style. Taken aback by the outcome of the fight, Katya was momentarily speechless. However, she quickly recomposed herself. With a bow, the young noblewoman acknowledged her opponent's skill. But inside, the frustration of defeat burned. For an instant, she imagined a different scenario, where she unleashed all her power in a furious attack against Derek. Except, even in her imagination, his reaction was terrifying. The coldness in his gaze showed a power she couldn't comprehend. The mere thought of that confrontation left her paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the sound of a bell broke the tension in the air. The old master intervened, declaring the end of the fight and praising Derek's effort. Katya explained that her determination came from the need to survive. The young man, in turn, seemed to finally feel the fatigue of the battle. Her sincerity, however, seemed to please the old master.
Later, in a moment of calm, Katya took the opportunity to give Derek some advice. She warned him about the master's temper, suggesting he be careful not to displease him. Katya then thanked Derek, admitting that she learned a lot from their confrontation. The young man seemed surprised by her acknowledgement. She continued, saying that with his skill, he didn't need to worry. Their conversation, however, did not go unnoticed by the old master. Katya confessed that she wasn't interested in weak opponents. Her statement left the apprentice curious. There was only one person she really wanted to beat. Her true rival was a mage named Eleanor Duplan. The name was said with a seriousness that left no doubt about her determination. As Derek processed the information, Katya finally seemed to remember where she knew his name from. With the conversation over, she dismissed him. The young man withdrew, leaving Katya behind with her thoughts. Alone again, she picked up her teacup. She reflected on the mercenary she had just met, and also on the rival she was determined to overcome. At that instant, Katya's determination became unwavering. Meanwhile, Derek walked away from the place, believing the conversation was over. But suddenly, something stopped him. It was Katya, who caught up with him and stopped him from leaving. The young apprentice stared at her, confused by the sudden change in attitude. She, however, had a confident smile, as she had made a decision. Katya took him to a more private place so they could talk. And there, in front of the fireplace, she went straight to the point. Derek listened attentively to the unexpected proposal. To prove her sincerity, Katya began to reveal her most vulnerable side. The young mercenary pondered her words, feeling the weight of that confession. The noblewoman then began to explain the past that motivated her. Her story completely captured Derek's attention.
The image of Katya and her determination now occupied his thoughts. And then, she finally asked the question that was the real reason for that conversation. Katya cut to the chase with a question that would define everything. How could she defeat Aiseline? The young mercenary paused, the sound of the cup echoing the weight of that request. She recognized her opponent's strength, but expressed her complete confidence in Derek's abilities. Derek listened in silence, analyzing each word and the sincerity behind them. The conversation continued in front of the fireplace, charged with a palpable urgency. He realized that this was not a request for praise or a simple whim. In her eyes, the mercenary saw genuine despair, the kind that made him understand the seriousness of the situation. Katya reminded him that he had beaten Aiseline before, but now she needed to ensure her own victory. The young man remained quiet, processing the intensity of that appeal.
He took a sip of tea, using the brief silence to organize his thoughts. Then, Derek finally broke the silence, ready to give his answer. Katya held her breath, awaiting the decision that could change her future. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room, marking the tension of the moment. In that hall, a dangerous agreement was beginning to form between the two. The mercenary admitted that there might be a method, but first, he had some conditions. Derek began to state his conditions, questioning whether she really understood what she was asking. The noblewoman stared at him, determined to accept whatever the price. The mercenary needed to be sure that she understood the gravity of her request. Katya did not hesitate in her response. She reaffirmed that she would do whatever it took to defeat her rival. Derek, however, still seemed skeptical of her sincerity. In a burst of passion, the young woman leaned over the table, knocking over the cups.
She declared that her ambition was much greater than worrying about the opinions of others. But the mercenary wasn't talking about pride or reputation. There was a fundamental misunderstanding that he needed to clarify. Katya leaned back, confident that she had resolved his concern. Except, she had completely misunderstood everything. Derek then remembered the method he used to train Dila. It wasn't a comfortable lesson. It was brutal training, where each lesson was learned on the battlefield. That was the true price of the power he offered, a path forged in real combat. She continued, explaining that she wasn't joking about her ambition. Derek listened in silence, without showing any reaction. Katya stated that, for someone who aspired to the top of the empire, failing in social circles would be absurd. She challenged him not to judge her sincerity, believing that he doubted her determination. But Derek had a much more practical concern in mind. When he finally interrupted her to talk about payment, the noble reacted with indignation. The young mercenary simply observed her reaction. He decided that, if she was serious, he should also be direct and use his own methods. Suddenly, it clicked for Katya. She understood that the issue wasn't about pride, but about money. Her anger instantly turned into shame. Completely embarrassed, the young woman could barely look at him. Derek, however, knew that the price he was about to demand had nothing to do with money.